We want to continue on with the story of the death and resurrection of Lazarus in John 1 to 11. We went through the first 4 verses last time, and I want to connect onto those and continue on in the 5th verse down through the 16th verse. Before I read those statements, though, let me give you a quote from MacArthur that I think does a very good job of explaining something a lot of people miss in the first part of this story. He's talking about the message that the sisters sent to Jesus about Lazarus' sickness. He said, "The sisters' message is beautiful in its tender simplicity. They did not spell out the details of Lazarus' condition, nor did they specifically ask the Lord to do anything. They realized that it would be extremely dangerous for him to travel anywhere near Jerusalem at this time," which you can see in verse 8, which we'll get to in a moment. They also did not attempt to manipulate Jesus by reminding him of Lazarus' affection for him. They merely appealed to the Lord's love. And he notes that the Greek word that's used for love that Mary and Martha used to refer to Jesus' love for their brother is phileo love, Phileo, the love of friendship and personal affection. And then he goes on to say, they humbly and trustingly brought the need to his attention. I think that's something that's easy to sometimes miss in this story, is that Mary and Martha did not ask Jesus to come help their brother. But there certainly was an assumption that because he loved Lazarus, he would come and help him, which will lead us right into the next few verses. So let me read John 11, 5 to 16, and then we'll get into some commentary on some of it. I'm not going to go through every part of that passage because Jesus does address a couple different things, but we will get into depth on the issues that are applicable to this subject of the soul and the afterlife, and in particular to the issue of death being referred to as sleep. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. When he had heard, therefore, that he was sick, he abode 2 days still in the same place where he was. Then after that saith he to his disciples, Let us go into Judea again. His disciples say unto him, Master, the Jews of late sought to stone thee, and goest thou thither again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he seeth the light of the world. But if a man walk in the night, he stumbleth, because there is no light in him. These things said he, and after that he saith unto them, Our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go, that I may awake him out of sleep. Then said his disciples, Lord, if he sleep, he shall do well. Howbeit Jesus spake of his death, but they thought that he had spoken of taking of rest in sleep. Then said Jesus unto them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go unto him. Then said Thomas, which is called Didymus, unto his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. Why did Jesus drag his feet for several days before leaving when he knew how sick Lazarus was? In the moment, it may have seemed insensible at best, or at worst, deeply insensitive for him to do that. But Jesus was doing exactly what God intended him to do. It may be that he knew that God did not intend for him to go to Bethany to heal Lazarus of a critical illness. He intended him to go there to raise him from the dead. It could also be true that he didn't know that Lazarus would die, but he knew that God did not want him to go at that time. If the latter was the case, God could have later told him that Lazarus had died. Though that last is possible, because there are things that God knows that Jesus doesn't know. Just consider Mark 13:32 as an evidence of that. But I don't think that idea is as likely as the first, especially considering the context and Jesus' statements. In either case, Jesus didn't go immediately to Bethany because Lazarus was intended by God to die before Jesus arrived. So that the miracle that Jesus accomplished should be more than just the healing of a sickness. It would be the raising of a man who had not only just died, but who had been dead and buried for several days, certifying that he truly died. R. Kent Hughes expands on the earlier issues of Mary and Martha's appeal that I started with a moment ago, stating that this was not an invitation or even a request. They did not say, Lord, please come. They just assumed that as soon as the Lord learned of the situation, he would hurry there. They knew Jesus. They understood his wonderful compassion. The word they used for love is the word for friendship. They were saying, your good friend whom you love is sick. By the way, then when the writer describes Jesus' love for them in verse 6, he uses a different word for love. Hughes goes on to say he uses the word agape, that highest type of love. Christ loves us with that kind of love. Knowing this, we might expect Scripture to say, Jesus, upon hearing that Lazarus was sick, went to one of his disciples, found a horse, and rode as fast as he could to be with Lazarus. But that's not what our text says. Our text says he loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus so much that he stayed away. From ground level, it sometimes appears to us that even though we're Christ and we love him, he does not care about us anymore. At times, humanly speaking, our circumstances seem to admit no other interpretation than that. And he later goes on to say, we must be honest and admit that at ground level, there are times when it's very difficult to keep believing in the goodness of God. But John 11 elevates our perspective. It explains to Christ's praying, devoted people that no matter how it may appear, these inexplicable delays are delays of love. That's what our text says. When we're being ravaged by the events of life, it's very difficult to believe that God really loves us. But John 11 and many other scriptures clearly claim that these delays are delays of love. God is all-powerful. He can do anything. He knows all. He even knows when a sparrow falls to the ground. He knows our plight, and he cares. How can we earthbound creatures come to understand God's love, to really believe it despite our crises? First of all, we must recognize that we never comprehend his workings in their completeness. When delays and hardships come to us, we cannot expect to know all the details, all the answers, all the reasons. If we spent all our time asking why, we would be using our time very unprofitably. The general principle is this: Christ delayed coming to his faithful, loving followers in Bethany in order to strengthen their love and their faith. Edward W. Klink III adds to that verse 5, which reminds the reader of the love of Christ for those involved in this crisis, is so significant, especially coming between verse 4 and verse 6 as it does. Quite simply, if God is intentional with the event of sickness and death, he can also be intentional with his response to such events. The mode in which God works, even if different than expected, must not be attributed to incompetence or insensitivity, but as befitting his greater purposes, even if unseen. In a moment of crisis, the however of God, he refers to verse 6, is not to believe more than the love of God, and he refers to verse 5. Moving on. When Jesus finally decides to leave for Bethany, the disciples are deeply concerned about his going into an area of Judea where his life might be endangered. In verse 8, it says that his disciples said unto him, Master, the Jews of late sought to stone thee, and goest thou thither again? William Barclay points out that when Jesus finally announced that he was going to Judea, his disciples were shocked and staggered. They remembered that the last time he was there, the Jews had tried to find a way to kill him. To go to Judea at that time seemed to them, as indeed humanly speaking it was, the surest way to commit suicide. By the way, this is why I believe Thomas makes the statement that he does at the end of this passage, when he said to his fellow disciples in the 16th verse, Let us also go, that we may die with him. Some have taken that as a reference to Lazarus' death, but stating that you would die with Lazarus would be oddly unnecessary, and it's far more contextual to conclude that Thomas is referring back to verse 8 and the fear of the disciples that the Jews would kill Jesus, and potentially them as well. Whether bravely or sarcastically, he was essentially saying, let's go with Jesus to Judea so that we can die with him if he's killed there by the Jews. Tucked in between those two declarations in John 11:8 and 11:16 are two deep sets of statements by Jesus. In the first, he touches on the hours of the day and the need to walk and to work in the light while you have the light. I'm not going to wade into that here because it would take us quite a bit of time and it would pull us away from the context of this study. In the second, he addresses the fact that Lazarus is dead in a way that will bring us back to our subject of death being described as sleep. In John 11:11, Jesus tells his disciples that our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go that I may awake him out of sleep. At this point, the disciples don't know yet that Lazarus has died, so they take this as a positive sign that Lazarus is just resting and perhaps sleeping off his sickness. And you can see this in their response in John 11:12, where they say, Lord, if he sleep, he shall do well. John 11:13 affirms that, stating that Jesus spake of his death, but they thought that he had spoken of taking of rest in sleep. Jesus then clarifies his meaning, correcting their misconception, declaring in John 11:14-15 that Lazarus is dead. And I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go unto him. Was Jesus' use of the word sleep just an oversight? Not taking the disciples' lack of comprehension of that expression into consideration? Or was it a very intentional vocabulary choice in order to teach a deep lesson about his conception of the nature of temporal death? I believe it was the latter, and that Jesus tactically intended to refer to Lazarus as sleeping when he knew the disciples would misunderstand it to mean that he was still alive, so that he could then teach them a lesson about the nature of death for those whom the Lord intends to raise back to life. I'm going to quote Barclay one more time because he explains this beautifully. He says that Jesus here began by saying that Lazarus was sleeping. To the disciples, that sounded good news, for there's no better medicine than sleep. But the word sleep has always had a deeper and more serious meaning. Jesus said of Jairus' daughter that she was asleep, Matthew 9:24. At the end of Stephen's martyrdom, we're told that he fell asleep, Acts 7:60. Paul speaks about those who sleep in Jesus, 1 Thessalonians 4:13, and of those witnesses of the resurrection who've now fallen asleep, 1 Corinthians 15:6. So Jesus had to tell them plainly that Lazarus was dead, and then he went on to say that for their sake this was a good thing, because it would produce an event which would buttress them even more firmly in their faith. The final proof of Christianity is the sight of what Jesus Christ can do. Words may fail to convince, but there is no argument against God in action. It's a simple fact that the power of Jesus Christ has made the cowards into heroes, doubters into men and women of certainty, selfish people into servants of all. Above all, it is the plain fact of history that again and again the power of Christ has made bad people good. That is what lays so tremendous a responsibility on the individual Christian. The design of God is that every one of us should be a living proof of his power. Our task is not so much to commend Christ in words, against which an argument can always be produced, but to demonstrate in our lives what Christ has done for us. Barclay always does such a good job of making points like that in such a poetically beautiful way. Though we will return to this when we talk about the death of Stephen that's described as him falling asleep in Acts 7:60, and Paul's description of the other overcomers as being asleep in 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 1 Corinthians 15 that Barclay referred to. These are all the same expression for the same condition, being dead. Every single time we see this description in the Scripture of someone falling asleep at the moment of their physical death, it is undeniably speaking of someone going out of conscious existence, at least for a period of time until they are awakened again when they return to life in a resurrection. That is inarguably what Jesus is referring to here. He's saying that Lazarus is dead, and that his description of Lazarus being asleep is just a poetic way of describing the fact that Lazarus is dead. That description's actually not unusual at all because it's how the Bible has used that terminology in every single occurrence associated with physical death up to this point. What would be unusual, if not insensible, and certainly unbiblical, would be if the meaning of sleep being associated with death suddenly changed after 4,000 years of God using that expression to refer to the condition of a person who is completely dead and entirely unconscious. But that's exactly what's believed by those who claim that believers, or perfect overcomers, never actually die, even for a temporary time, prior to receiving a resurrection. To believe such a thing flies in the face of the fact that both the Old and the New Testaments refer to people who truly and fully died as being asleep and awaiting a resurrection when they'll be awakened back to conscious life. The Old and the New Testaments never use the expression of dead people being asleep to refer to them being conscious and active in the afterlife, let alone living in heaven prior to the future resurrection of the dead. Jesus made it clear that when he said Lazarus was sleeping, he meant Lazarus was dead, not that Lazarus was still alive in some conscious and active state somewhere else. Even if someone were to make the unbiblical argument that a person being described as sleeping after their physical death might describe them as still alive and in heaven, if they were sleeping, they wouldn't know they were in heaven. And if they were asleep, they wouldn't be able to consciously act or interact with anyone else there. So what would be the point of them being in heaven if they were there in a state of semi-conscious or even comatose sleep? There would be no point. And that would directly contradict the way the Bibles use the word sleep to refer to those who are dead, unconscious, and inactive, who will remain so until they're awakened back to life in a future resurrection. If we simply let the Bible speak for itself, especially when its expressions are simple and straightforward, we may avoid unbiblical ideas about the soul and the afterlife. As we've seen, the Bible has consistently and clearly defined the sleep of death as true death and not some conscious active existence somewhere after physical death. There would be no point in describing those who physically died as being asleep if they were conscious and active somewhere, especially when the description of the physically dead as being asleep, as it's used consistently in the Bible up to this point, has always meant a state of unconscious inactivity. That is an indisputable fact. The only way to try to overcome that fact is to try to reinvent the meaning of the word sleep when it refers to the state of the dead in the very next scripture in the Bible where it does so, which we'll come back to and examine later, when it describes Stephen falling asleep in Acts 7:60. And then in the statement of Paul about overcomers being asleep in 1 Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians that we'll address later as well. Before we do that, though, next time we'll continue on in the story of Lazarus' death and resurrection, since there are several other insights into death and the afterlife in that story that we do not want to miss. Well, as Brother Isaac Aka likes to say, this is a brief commercial. Though it's a commercial for something that won't cost you a single thing, unless you decide at some point you want to donate to it. I want to make sure all of you who listen to our podcast are also aware of our Substack page and that you've signed up for email updates to that page. We started a new Substack page right around Thanksgiving of last year. Substack is an online site and an app that you can use on your phone or tablet or whatever the case might be. You can even sign on directly to the website on your computer. It's primarily used to publish written materials. Some of its earliest users were journalists and companies that wanted to publish articles and things in newsletters that people could easily access. Many people are now beginning to use it for more technical things and for religious studies, and that's exactly what we're doing. Our page on Substack is a place where we're putting out all of our written religious studies. We haven't added every single thing all at one time. It's being done progressively as we're adding new material all the time, but it is becoming, it will become a huge storehouse of written studies and devotions and even all of our different books and things we've written so that someone can access them very easily. Some of the new written studies we're going through that you can find the materials for on our Substack page go hand in hand with these podcasts. They're usually a trimmed down version of the podcast in a written form, sometimes with diagrams and pictures and other things. We're also going through some subjects on our Substack page that are on subjects we have not put on the podcast, some of which are very in-depth studies, especially for our ministers that we work with. Gain access to our Substack page is very simple, and there's no cost associated with normal access to the page. To read our different articles and studies and devotions that we've published on there, all you need to do is either go to Substack online or download the Substack app and then look up The Bare Truth, the same name as this podcast, TheBaerTruth, and you'll find our Substack page. And then when you come to the Substack page, all you need to do then is make sure that you subscribe to the page. You can read some of the things on the page without subscribing, but subscribing accomplishes several things. Number one, every time we add something new, you get an update to it to your email. The other thing that is extremely beneficial for this ministerial work is that the more people subscribe to the page, the higher it rises in the search rankings, which means people who are searching for certain information or subjects online are going to find the page and have access to our materials much easier. So it's a heavily evangelistic tool to reach people that becomes more and more effective the more people are subscribed to it. So the more subscribers we have, the more visible it becomes to people who are searching for that kind of information. So if you haven't already subscribed to our Substack page, or if maybe you have, but there's someone else in your family that hasn't, every single subscriber we have to the Substack page causes it to become more visible to the search engines. So again, more people will find that information who maybe had never have encountered us before. And that is the goal of the preaching of the messages of the gospel. So once more, you can find the Substack page either by downloading Substack, that's just Substack, Substack, to your computer, downloading the app to your phone or mobile device of whatever kind you're using, laptop, tablet, whatever it is you're using. Or you can just go online and search for Substack and then search for The Bare Truth and you'll find us on there. I said access the Substack page is free. There is an option for those who donate to have access to some additional material that we publish on there that's really just for our members and for the ministers I work with. But I feel like if someone is willing to donate something to help support the cost of the page, we'll let them have access to that material as well. So the vast majority of what's on our Substack page is openly available to everyone, but there are some special studies, and some of which are on some more controversial issues that are only available to members who are part of the churches in Ohio that I work with, and are available to the ministers I work with overseas, but are also available to anyone who is a supporting subscriber, meaning you're donating towards a subscription, which it gives you that option when you choose to subscribe, whether or not you want to have a donating subscription or just a regular subscription. Thank you for your support. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the many, many questions we get that get sent in. Please be patient with me when I'm not able to answer them very quickly. There are some days that I can have sometimes in the hundreds of calls and messages that come in, and I'm not always able to quickly respond to those. And then sometimes when people send in questions, it may take a little bit of time before I'm able to answer those. But some of those things I will be responding to on our Substack page where I can quickly write an answer. That if I've had 5 or 6 different ministers or saints that have asked a question on a certain subject, I can answer all those people at one time by writing some that they all can look at. I don't have to send a message each one of them individually. That's exactly what we're doing with our newest subject that we've been discussing on the Substack page, which is the Spirit of Christ versus the Spirit of God, as well as getting into the subject of how we need to develop the spirit and disposition of Christ and how that process works. I got a lot of questions on that subject, and so I decided to answer them by going through a written study of that then any of the people that have asked the questions can follow the study. One more time, I want to say thank you for the support, for listening to our podcast, and for supporting our Substack page. May God richly bless you, and may He keep you.